Hi, everybody. I'm Chief Meteorologist and Hurricane Specialist Ivan Cabrera here with the next weather team. What's almost better than the holidays? I think it should be a holiday.
Yes,
it's the end of hurricane season, and we made it. We made it in South Florida without a big storm. In fact, we didn't get any storms here. Going back and talking about Ian, what a year the past year was, but this year relatively quiet. Of course, our friends in the Big Bend, we know you got Idalia, so we'll be talking about that, and we'll talk about what an interesting season it was. They're always unique, but this one was a little bit tricky to start off and to forecast. Here is what happened. I don't know if you guys remember, but NOAA came out with the original forecast, and they switched it to a much higher forecast, right? So, I mean, the range is it's hard to miss because they have a big range there, but still, 20 storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3. So we were perfect as far as climatology with Hurricane 7 and 3 of them becoming at Cat 3s or higher. I've never seen them dramatically switch the forecast like that. They had their initial forecast out, and they had their mid-season, and they went full.
Well, the thinking was that it was going to be a weak season because El Niño.
Right.
So
we've been talking about La Niña so many times. Now we've got to switch gears and talk about El Niño, a whole different story. And by the way, that we'll be talking about our winter outlook, and El Niño is going to play a role. Look at what we did, though. This was the 4th busiest season on record as far as total named storms. Right? We've had more hurricanes in a season, but as far as the numbers there, it was tied for 3rd. And then in the end here, coming up on the end of the season, we had the 4th busiest on record. And it's interesting because a lot of folks are like, how 4th busiest, really? When you don't get hit,
quiet here.
It's not a bad season when you don't get hit like we did last year. There are the names, guys.
Yeah, the big one was Idalia, but it started early with Arlene and Brett and Cindy, and we even had that storm in January.
Nobody remembers that.
The no-name storm.
Right. And if you're counting at home, I mean, it doesn't match up because we did have that no-name subtropical storm in January. Hurricane Center goes back and does forensics through the off-season, and they determine whether a system that developed, had enough tropical or subtropical characteristics to name it that, and so we ended up with 20. We had 7 hurricanes, of course, the 3 big ones, and we did have Idalia, of course, which was a major hurricane making landfall in the Big Bend. So that was the big storm of the season. We talk about why they forecast, the National Hurricane Center forecasted a almost average to below average season. It was supposed to be El Niño-driven wind shear, Dave.
Right. This is the main development region, 10 to 20 degrees north, and about 75% of major hurricanes form in this area here. So this is the area that they watch. Typically, you get waves coming off of Africa, moving over this area. Initially, with El Niño, wind shear, which inhibits storms, was thought to be a big factor here. But then as the season evolved, we were getting warmer and warmer ocean temperatures, warmest ocean temperatures on record, so that's why they adjusted the forecast. Now, typically in this area, and this year was really no different, you get that Saharan dust initially coming off there. So June, July, had a few storms, but a lot of it suppressed the activity. But then we get to August 13th, and we start to see storms forming in this area here, so right on schedule here. But a lot of them turned. They're up to the north, but this was the area that we were watching, and those were the 2 thoughts.
And we did get, plenty of wind shear. We'll talk about that with the tracks here, but the warmest ocean temperatures on record really just split the season. And so all of a sudden, when we thought El Niño was just going to take care of everything for the season, these warm sea surface temperatures started. I mean, we had a slow start, but then we had easterly wave after easterly wave turning into not just, mind you, tropical storms and hurricanes, but some major hurricanes as well, taking advantage of that fuel with those very warm sea surface temperatures. But in that little box there, we're going to talk about the lack of storms and why our chances of getting hit got much lower here in South Florida. And yes, now we're going to talk about El Niño and how that compares to La Niña, which we had last year, which favors a lot of activity. El Nino saved us this year, I think, Casey.
Yeah. I mean, this is actually the first time we've had an El Nino since the past 3 years. We had that triple dip for 2002, 2001, and 2022. So this is the first time we've had an El Nino pattern in a while, and that's when we get those above average Pacific waters that leads to the rising motion of air, area of low pressure developing, and then that eventually develops into a trough, a dip in the subtropical jet stream that then eventually pushes over across the Gulf into the Atlantic. That leads to that increased wind shear. We're talking about that change in wind as you go up in the atmosphere, and when you get that jet stream going across, it's basically just a river of wind. That leads to hostile conditions for development. Tears storms apart. That's why it's very difficult to develop anything, typically, historically speaking, in an El Nino season, because we have all that vertical wind shear. But yeah, as we've been talking about, we had record warm water temperatures, and that kind of offset everything. And this actually was had on record the most named storms out of any El Nino influenced season.
Yeah, it was you know, it's not something that you typically expect with an El Nino season, more like a La Nina situation here. The thunderstorms, you know, the storms that try to develop into tropical storms have a hard time doing that, and even the ones too that do develop, say, to the east and go into that region, they encounter the same hostility as far as those upper level winds, and all of a sudden a storm that would have barreled west and done something with the islands, or perhaps even with Florida and the rest of the Gulf, never made it. They just fell apart. We saw a lot of them fizzling out, and some just diving down into South America, where things were a little bit more hospitable there. But definitely, this was, you know, this was key. We really weren't sure at the beginning how strong El Nino was going to be. It was a pretty average El Nino, and then it started strengthening. And so the stronger the El Nino, the warmer the Pacific waters, the more hostile winds that develop here with that subtropical jet. So we love to see that. Let's check in on the tracks and go back to June 1st, and Cindy will take us through here and take a look at all the. Yep, there they are.
Come on, yeah. So this was a busy year when you look out in the Atlantic. Not so much for the United States and for the Gulf, but out in the Atlantic, you notice all these tracks starting out here, the Cape Verde or the Cabo Verde season is what we call this, when these storms develop off of Africa, and this is where they come from, and they move westward. You'll notice that the hurricanes are in the red lines, so we had plenty of them, but the pink lines, these were the major hurricanes, the ones that were Cat 3 or greater, but really Lee stands out here. This is the one, the long one, the pink one, and then it curves to the north there. That one was a rapid intensification hurricane, reached winds of 165 miles per hour, but fortunately stayed away from the United States and certainly stayed away from land. So even though we had a lot of systems going on out there in the Atlantic, we didn't get bothered here. So that was certainly
a lot of fish storms.
A lot of fish storms this year.
We did say that a lot.
Great.
And you know, this is the thing. You can have the fourth busiest season on record, and all of a sudden it didn't look bad for the U.S. Now, of course, you know, there were three exceptions that we'll talk about, the three landfalls here that did make it in, and of course one was a hurricane in Idalia.
Yeah, Arlene was the first named storm of the season, but fortunately Arlene stayed out in the open waters of the Gulf of Mexico. But then we had two landfalling tropical storms, Harold and Ophelia, and then of course the only landfalling hurricane in the U.S. was Idalia. So I want to talk about a little bit Harold, which developed as a wave on August 20th, and then as it moved over record warm sea surface temperatures in the Gulf, it gained strength and became a tropical storm and made landfall over in South Texas, over Padre Island on August 23rd. It actually did bring much needed rain to drought-stricken southern Texas, and some severe gusts over 60 miles per hour in Corpus Christi. And then a few days later, August 27th, we had Idalia developed near the Yucatan Channel, and then as it meandered over the Gulf, it of course was able to intensify, and then rapidly intensified, and when it made landfall, it was classified a Category 3, right? And this was on August 30th, and it made landfall near Keaton Beach in the Florida Big Bend area, and it just brought devastation there. And I know, Ivan, you're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but before we get to that, I did want to mention Tropical Storm Ophelia briefly because it did form over here in the western Atlantic and eventually made landfall over in eastern North Carolina, and that was near Emerald Isle, and that was on September 23rd. And it did bring some heavy rain, flooding, gusty winds, as well as some significant river flooding, as well as storm surge to portions of eastern North Carolina.
That was almost a hurricane. I mean, it made landfall with 70 miles an hour.
It was a strong tropical storm.
4 more, and you got yourself a hurricane. So that was a pretty, high-end tropical storm there.
Well, it's interesting too, as drought conditions over here on the Gulf side of the state, it's extremely dry, which is unusual. They didn't get the rain because they didn't have any tropical systems that made landfall there. So everything moved across and came over here on the east side and dumped a lot of rain for us here on the east side. But this is very unusual to see a pattern like that.
With the temperatures, though, that we had in the Gulf of Mexico, I tell you what, I did not want anything going into the Gulf. We all talked about it, and we said, if anything gets into the Gulf with the right setup here, we've never seen, we had water temperatures, of course, it's different in the open Gulf, but we have water temperatures here in the Bay in the 90s.
101, right? 101.
Right.
That was unbelievable.
So, and that's when we talk about rapid intensification. You bet that can happen. What happened with Lee can certainly happen over the Gulf, and we've seen that how many times play out. So, thankfully, we did not have a lot of coverage here. We had a lot of wind shear as well, so that was able to, take out some of the storms that would have been. But there is Idalia. There's a track, meandered a little bit over the Yucatan, then crossed over into the Gulf of Mexico. That one was also worrying because it was going to go over some of the warmest, water temperatures that we have in the Atlantic Basin here. So it did intensify, and it did become a major hurricane, and then weakened a little bit before it made landfall as a Category 3. The storm surge was significant. We had upwards of 12 to 15-foot storm surge. So the kind of numbers that you hear about, when we were covering Lee last year, or covering Ian last year, I should say. But this thankfully did not cause any fatalities, and the Hurricane Center is in part talking about how they're now putting the 7-day outlook out so they give people more heads up, which is one of the things that a lot of folks complained about with Ian last year, is that they weren't sure where it was going. They didn't know about it until it was too late, and so hopefully lessons learned. We talked about that last year with Idalia as it pushed through as a Cat 3 there with 125-mile-an-hour winds. And when you get one hurricane landfall in hurricane season, that is not bad at all. Of course, our state got hit again there up towards Keaton Beach, so the folks there are going to be doing some recovery. They had significant flooding as well as the storm pushed up to the north. So that was the main deal. I mean, it's always surprising the seasons when you talk about all these factors that come into play. And we talk about El Niño, we talk about sea surface temperatures, but there are other global circulation patterns that are factored in. And so everything came together for what was a relatively quiet season for us, and we're hoping that next year is going to be just the same.
Oh, yes.
El Niño is going to go through, as you guys know, through the spring.
Right.
We know that. Whether there's a double dip El Niño, that just remains to be seen, right? So in the winter, we'll talk about more how El Niño drives that jet stream that KC was talking about. When you get a jet stream overhead and you start getting cold fronts through, it's a problem. You start getting into a severe weather. Anybody's name up here?
No. I know Cindy.
We had Cindy last year. And Cindy this year.
And it didn't
And we actually had some of our producers, Alex and Bonnie, too. Their names were part of the list last year.
I'm sure you're out there, and I'm sure your name is on here, although I've never met a barrel. I don't know about you guys.
My husband's name is on there.
Oh, is it?
Tony.
Oh, there you go.
There you go.
Tony is in.
I just
Patty.
my name, whatever. I'm Patty.
Oh, Patty, yeah.
We have a Raphael.
So, everybody knows somebody on here, I'm sure. And I tell you what, this is interesting. Everyone always asks, because some names can be a little bit strange for us in the States. This list is compiled by the World Meteorological Organization, and so they come up with this list, which is recycled, by the way, every 6 years. Beryl is hanging in there. We have had
is.
Beryl
Many.
for
I feel like I've been saying barrel so
just
many years
since
now.
I think late 90s. I mean, it's been something.
Yeah.
The National Hurricane Center retires the name if the storm is either significant meteorologically, climatologically wise, or whether, of course, it caused any injuries, death, and economic losses there.
Right.
So you'll never have a Hurricane Ivan or Ian or Andrew, obviously. And so there are our names for next year, and hopefully.
Idalia, will it be retired? We talked about that
I
a little
know.
bit.
Good.
Don't
Yeah.
think so?
Yeah.
Don't
It's
think
interesting.
so?
We don't, just because they turn into, Cat 5s doesn't necessarily
Doesn't mean
mean they
it.
get retired. It was over open water, so we'll see, if they decide to do that. But, we almost made it to the entire list this year. This is, fourth busiest hurricane season. We went all the way to Tammy. We had Vince and Whitney. So we had two names before we go to that backup list that nobody wants to talk about.
Sure, no.
And hopefully we won't have to use it next year. Any last thoughts, you guys, about 2023?
Just grateful that
Yeah,
it was quiet
grateful.
year. But
Yeah. The folks that did get
We
hit,
all
though, they think a little bit differently.
Of
But my
course.
goodness, this could have been so much worse with these water temperatures. Record highs
That's what I was
out of the
concerned
park.
with.
Yeah.
Even in the North Atlantic, temperatures
Yeah.
were record high. And what is that going to do down the road? Talking about what's next now.
Right.
We know that these water temperatures can continue to rise like this. We're looking ahead now, so we get maybe a La Nina year next down the road. What does that mean?
Right. I mean, it's, and climate change obviously plays a fact. Now over 90% of the energy from the sun is absorbed by the water temperature when we emit carbon emissions. And so it's going to be a problem going forward. The storms that do develop, even say we have, 7 storms next year, those 7 can develop in an environment where it favors, rapid
and become a
intensification.
super storm.
Worst
super
case
hurricanes that
scenario.
we
I
have
mean,
now.
I won't forget Otis, which obviously didn't hit our basin here, but in Mexico, boy, that was never seen
was
anything like that.
heartbreaking.
12 hours, tropical
Terrible.
storm to a Category 5, and could we see that here? Certainly, we don't
Scary.
hope that we do, but
Scary.
we'll stay on top of it for you. So. Enjoy the holidays. Enjoy, a good 6 months
6
off.
months.
We will not be off. We will start, going through the data and the forecast and not bother you about it until we get, closer to next season. We deserve a good half a year without thinking about, some storm coming in our direction. So with that, thank you for watching, and hopefully we'll see you, too soon here in the tropics, but we'll stay on top of it for you, and we will be back as well to talk about El Nino, because it's not going away, and it'll impact our winter significantly. So we'll see you next time.